Hey, good morning. It's nice to see everybody here. We have the third Sunday of Advent. It is henceforth known in Epiphany Parish as C.S. Lewis Sunday. Well, why not? Right, John? We'll put it on the calendar for next year as well. For those of you who don't know John Roberts, I'm pleased to announce that he's going to be our speaker this morning. For those of you that do know John Roberts, you know why you're here. Because he's an extraordinary scholar on the C.S. Lewis. He teaches the C.S. Lewis Minion here, which has met on and off for 8 years or so.
Closer to
10 years? I mean, for a long time. But the good news on that is C.S. Lewis has a lot of material. And the better news is John's read all of it. And have you read all of C.S. Lewis?
I can't think of what I've missed.
Yeah, so John's read all of C.S. Lewis and all of the scholars that surround C.S. Lewis. And so it is with just great pleasure to introduce John and his conversation on C.S. Lewis today. I've learned a lot over the years and incorporated C.S. Lewis into the way I think about Jesus and the church and theology. So I'm going to keep talking, John, now, because I know you have a lot to say about C.S. Lewis. So let's have a quick prayer. God of grace and God of glory, you unite us through the wisdom of the ages, one of whom is your beloved son, prophet, and theologian, scholar, C.S. Lewis, and for John Roberts, this capacity to own and incorporate and share the great wisdom of C.S. Lewis for this class and our time together. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
All right, have that. Good luck.
Well, thank you. It is, it's so good to be back. I think I gave a first C.S. Lewis presentation here 11 years ago. And you'll note that I haven't learned a great deal, in that there's an alarming number of Post-it notes that I'm going to work my way through. And I've decided that I'm just going to talk for a half hour, however far I get, and then stop and do Q&A, because I honestly don't want to rush through the material, and I want it to be conversational and a little impromptu. So when I think about C.S. Lewis, I've thought about a number of titles for this presentation, and a very good title could be the way I would explain Lewis. If I were to rewrite Mere Christianity, how would I do it? How would I engage people in the material of Lewis to make the case for Christianity? And that's essentially what this presentation is. That also leads to the title of the presentation, which is C.S. Lewis's Greatest Hits. Because it, not too surprisingly, volume 1, I wrote Greatest Hits, and then I was like, oh, there could be, this could be Elton John, right? I mean, it could just go on and on and on, given the body of his material. So I thought the first thing I would do is explain Lewis's own conversion experience, and then how that maps to the material. So Lewis's own conversion experience, as described in Surprised by Joy, is that when he was a young boy, he saw a little tin with some growth coming out of it, a little plant or something. And it just kind of sparked in him a longing. He felt moved by that. And his first sense of something outside of himself was this sense of longing. We then move forward to when he's 15, studying under the great Knock, Professor Patrick. I could just digress all day long. So I'm going to keep moving because he's also Professor Kirk and the Narnia tales, etc. But and he picked up a book by George MacDonald, Fantasies, and he was just swept into a new world, right? And he felt that MacDonald had baptized his imagination and that he was transported. He says in his book, he covered a great frontier, right? He was just moved. And at that time, he was a profound atheist because the great Knock had kind of argued Christianity out of his system. We then go into World War II, World War I, where Lewis was injured and convalescing, and he encounters G.K. Chesterton. And it's interesting to segue between MacDonald and Chesterton. What moved him about Chesterton was his essential goodness. essential goodness. You know, he just sensed this. And then, of course, Chesterton, a fierce intellectual, the author of, you know, if you were to ask someone in the 1920s, what's the book you should read if you want to become a Christian, they would have said Everlasting Man, which is Chesterton's book. And so Lewis was engaged in that material and started to get the logic of Christianity. He then went to Oxford and, of course, the Inklings and J.R. Tolkien and all that group of friends. And so that's kind of the logic phase. What I find interesting is he goes from the emotional imagination attracted by goodness into essentially the logic and the discourse at Oxford amongst the Inklings. And of course, Lewis is exceedingly well read, exceedingly well read, and essentially a pattern matcher. So he sees the patterns that we're going to talk about, right? The essential goodness, something external to yourself.
Downstairs,
People are coming on. This is kind of the Zoom thing is kind of a nice augmentation to our new world. In any case, so you have this melding. Can you imagine staying up with the Inklings 2 nights a week till 2 a.m, debating literature and topics, and being the first people to hear The Hobbit, you know, and all these sort of stories. And Lewis is immersed in this, and he's seeing these fundamental patterns that he could not avoid. Just being intellectually honest, he could not avoid the fact that he was seeing these patterns of good, evil, transformation. And he came to believe intellectually, and those two things met. His sense of longing and those two things met. And then he first committed to essentially believing in God. He calls himself in Surprised by Joy the most reluctant convert in the history of Christianity. But it wasn't until 1931, September 22nd. I remember that because Tolkien, that's the birthday of Frodo Baggins. It's kind of fun. I think it's the only acknowledgement of that date that I've seen on his conversion experience. But he's riding in the sidecar with his brother, Warren, and boom, it just dawns on him. He said it was like waking from a dream. At the beginning of the ride, he didn't believe in the centrality of Christ. At the end of the ride, he did. Nothing happened during the ride. And so then he goes on, of course, to become a great apologist. You're going to see in this talk that I'm going to reference a lot of Narnia. And it's because Narnia basically speaks to the emotional experience. I mean, it's the reason why it stuck with us so long is because it's so approachable. It appeals to us at such a deep level. And so I'm going to reference a lot of Narnia throughout. And so we'll begin. I had some other just stunningly good insights that I can't quite recall. The thing about Lewis is also, this is the thought, right? When I was going through the materials and flipping through a whole stack of books, I could have used an entirely different set of quotations, right? Because Owen Barfield, who Lewis called his second friend, his first friend was Arthur Greaves, who they agreed on everything, loved, great Nordic myth and everything. Owen Barfield is the person that they read all the same books and he drew all the wrong answers. So he was the friend that challenged him, and he credits essentially Barfield and Tolkien for getting him over the line with onto Christianity. But Owen Barfield said the thing about Lewis is the centrality of his thought. That if you take these key themes, of which I'm going to touch on a few, you see these themes played out in all of his materials. And so the fun thing in reading Lewis is you can read something here, see it represented there, see it represented there. So it's like these different angles on the same thought. There's an amazing coherency to what Lewis talks about. And so we'll see that. Did it work? Sure, we did, it did work. Fabulous. So first, let me clear the slide. St. Francis, and that sort of represents this mystical longing for joy. Aslan, one of the great treats of my life was I got to sit up here with Rowan Williams and do a Q&A on C.S. Lewis. And I asked Rowan what was his favorite Narnian vignette, right? What captured him? And he said it was this one. It was Aslan singing creation into existence. And it's just such a fabulous scene. And there's Joy and Lewis during their honeymoon. And so, people, when he came out, was surprised by Joy. Everybody thought that was quite clever. And so he experienced real relational joy very late in his life. And it was after that that he wrote the Four Loves and a few, and of course, Grief Observed, unfortunately. But it added new texture to his understanding, at least of relationship. So what I thought I would do in kicking off, and so the cadence of this thing is going to be a few observations, some post-it notes, a few observations and post-it notes, just so you know. So this is from Dallas Willard. Dallas is, of course, Dwight's hero. And I found this book, I will note, Life Without Lack, to be incredibly approachable. So I commend it to you because it's conversational. It's based on talks that Dallas Willard gave. And my personal view is I would treat this as the on-ramp to Willard because the other stuff is heavy lift, but good. So this is a statement on, this is Life Without Lack by Dallas Willard. The entire book is on the 23rd Psalm. It's incredible. So this is Willard. A joyous God fills the universe. Joy is the ultimate word describing God and his world. Creation was an act of joy, of delight in the goodness of what was done. It is precisely because God is like this, and because we know that he is like this, that a life full of contentment is possible. So isn't that a great description, right? That joy is the key thing. He then goes on to describe God as one of the great discoveries of modern science is that what we call matter is really energy. And so he goes on to describe God as a form of incredibly positive energy, and then draws all sorts of analogies about how that can, how you can do miracles. If you can control energy and there's a relationship between matter and energy, a lot of things become possible. And so now let's go into Lewis. So Lewis's great influence, as I mentioned, was George MacDonald. And MacDonald's works are fabulous. They're not, we've done them in the Minion, and you kind of have to get into them a little bit because it's myth and fantasy, and it was written 150 years ago. But and so this is him when he encountered in that train station his first exposure to George MacDonald. So at least I have found him. In making this collection, I was discharging a debt of justice. I have never concealed the fact that I regarded him as my master. Indeed, I fancy I have never written a book in which I did not quote from him, but it does not seem to me that those who have received my books kindly take even now sufficient notice of the affiliation. And every edition of fantasy. A few hours later, I knew that I had crossed a great frontier. I had already been waist deep in romanticism and likely enough at any moment to flounder into its darker and more evil forms. And so this is that longing. And if you read George MacDonald, it's this constant sense of movement and longing that you see throughout it that's sort of intangible. And he describes that longing in, of course, Surprised by Joy. This is his, fundamental autobiography. And again, I think the right on-ramp to his case for Christianity, because people can relate to this. It was a sensation, of course, of desire. But desire for what? Not certainly for a biscuit tin filled with moss, nor even though that came into it, from my own past. And before I knew what I desired, the desire itself was gone. The whole glimpse withdrawn, the world turned commonplace again, or only stirred by a longing for the longing that had just ceased. And so when Lewis talks about his progression, he talks an awful lot about this longing pulling him forward, right? You wonder, what was it that kept this person from the age of 15 to essentially the age of 30, an active engagement on this topic? What propelled him? And it was this longing. So now I go to the way to glory. to correct myself, I have not read all of Lewis, because Lewis wrote an incredible number of essays, gave an incredible number of sermons, and there's massive collections on him. Probably the one that is best known is The Way to Glory, where he makes the case for Christianity in the World War II era. And this he's going to describe how this joy infuses everything that we see, that we're attracted to the goodness, right? Remember the Chesterton statement on goodness. Okay. So he talks about Wordsworth and other people that were drawn. The books or the music in which we thought the beauty was located will betray us if we trust to them. It was not in them, it only came through them. And what came through them was longing. Isn't that beautiful? So, I think of this, when I'm, in a cathedral or walking. Elizabeth and I walk our dog every morning along Leschi, and you see the mountain and the beautiful sunrise. And there's something that's stirring within you. And the question is, what is that that's stirring within you? And Lewis would call that a longing. So now here's another, later in that lecture, he refers to this longing as a pointer, another great example. And now notice what has happened. If I had rejected the authoritative and scriptural image of glory and stuck obstinately to the vague desire which was, at that onset, my only pointer to heaven, I could have seen no connection at all between the desire and a Christian promise. So basically, he's calling this longing, this sense of joy, which he also calls a sense of joy, as a pointer towards heaven. So he's weaving all of these things together in such an incredible way. And now, okay, so there is the order in which you should read. The order in which you should read Narnia is the way that it was done when it was first printed. You should read it in the order of publishing, not chronologically. And okay, so that is The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Prince Caspian, Voyage of the Dawn Treader, Silver Chair, Horse and His Boys, Magician Nephew, and The Last Battle. And the reason you want to read it in order of publication is the story is ultimately about the revealing of Aslan. And so it's not necessarily chronologically what adventures the kids go through. It's how Aslan reveals himself to the kids. And so this is, I'm making this transition to the first time Aslan is encountered in Narnia. They say Aslan is on, of course, this is Mr. Beaver talking, of course, everybody knows that. They say Aslan is on the move, perhaps has already landed. And now, this is great. And now a very curious thing happened. None of the children knew who Aslan was any more than you do. But the moment the beaver had spoken these words, everyone felt quite different. Perhaps as something happened to you in a dream, that someone says something which you don't understand. But in the dream, it feels as if it had some enormous meaning, either a terrifying one, which turns the whole dream into a nightmare, or else a lovely meaning, too lovely to put into words, which makes the dream so beautiful that you remember it all your life and are always wishing you could get into that dream again. It was like that now. At the name of Aslan, each one of the children felt something jump in his inside. And Edmund, who of course betrays Aslan, felt a sensation of mysterious horror. Peter felt suddenly brave and adventurous. Susan felt as if some delicious smell or some delightful strain of music had just floated by her. And Lucy got the feeling that you have when you wake up in the morning and realize that it's the beginning of the holidays. I mean, isn't this just incredible? And you see, again, right? We're just seeing the centrality of thought, right? You're seeing how longing is picking up the sense of movement, the sense of feeling. And this is a quotation that Dwight used a couple of weeks ago. And they're trying to understand Aslan. Edmund's now left, and they're trying to figure out what to do vis-a-vis the queen, the White Witch. And Lucy says, is he a man? Asked Lucy. Aslan a man? Said Mr. Beaver sternly. Certainly not. I tell you, he's the king of the wood and the son of the great emperor beyond the sea. Don't you know who is the king of beasts? Aslan is a lion, the great lion. Oh, said Susan, I thought he was a man. Is he quite safe? I shall feel rather nervous about meeting a lion. That you will, dearie, and no mistake, said Mrs. Beaver. If there's anyone who can appear before Aslan without their knees knocking, they're either braver than most or else just silly. Then he isn't safe, said Lucy. Safe? Said Mr. Beaver. Don't you hear what Mrs. Beaver is telling you? Who said anything about safe? Of course he isn't safe, but he's good. Isn't that great? He's not safe, but he's good. He's the king, I tell you. I just kind of want to sit and say, wow, that's so great. And then I'll do one more Narnia, and then we'll move on to the next topic, because that's super key when you give a presentation to get through 2 of your 6 slides. So this, so if Rowan Williams' favorite episode was Aslan singing Narnia into creation, mine is this vignette on A Horse and His Boy. So Shasta, who was a Narnian, although we didn't know it, he was raised by the Calamarines in the southern country, a lot of Moorish overtones, and sort of an authoritative state, goes on this great adventure. And now he's lost from the group, and he's really had a hard time with it, and he's feeling very bad, and he's lost on this horse that he doesn't know how to ride. And all of a sudden he hears someone breathing very loudly, and he realizes he's not alone, and he asks if it is it, and this voice says, tell me your troubles. And he goes on about how he'd been lost and how a lion had chased him here and how he'd been threatened there, and he's just the most unluckiest guy and in the whole world. And so now I'm going to pick it up. Don't you think it was bad luck to meet so many lions? Said Shasta. There was only one lion, said the voice. What on earth do you mean? I just told you there were at least 2 at the first night, and there was only one, but he was swift of foot. How do you know? I was the lion. And as Shasta gaped, he opened his mouth. The voice continued. I was the lion who forced you to join with Erebus. I was the cat who comforted you among the houses of the dead. I was the lion who drove the jackals from you while you slept. I was the lion who gave the horses the new strength of fear for the last mile so that you could reach King Loon in time. And I was the lion you do not remember who pushed the boat in which you lay, a child near death, so that when it comes to shore where a man sat wakeful at night to receive you, then it was you who wounded Erebus. It was I. But for what? Child, said the voice, I am telling you your story, not hers. I tell no one any story but his own. Who are you? Asked Shasta. Myself, said the voice, very deep and low, so that the earth shook, and again, myself, loud and clear and gay, and then the third time, myself, whispered so softly you could hardly hear it, and yet it seemed to come from all around you, as if the leaves rustled with it. I mean, wow. The theology and all of that, right? You could unpack that whole thing, and it's got John in there, it's got Yahweh, it's got the various ways that we experience Christ. It is just incredible. And of course, almost everything I just said was related to this life. So when we think about the centrality of Aslan and the beauty of that, I'll just make a note, right? That I think the progression of most people towards Christianity is very similar to the progression that Lewis had, which is, I think most people would agree, very high percentage, 80, 90%, that there's something outside of ourselves, that there's some force. Most people probably agree that that force is probably positive. Most people don't really think or agree necessarily with that there's an evil force. But here's an interesting thing, right? If you believe in natural laws, we believe in gravity, although we don't entirely understand what causes gravity, right? The whole path that led to quantum physics, in part, although I say this hesitantly with Kevin in the audience and other scientists, was that people couldn't understand the difference between the force of gravitational force and magnetic force, what was exerting the force, right? We can often understand the what we observe because we observe it, but we don't understand the how. And that's certainly the case in science, and has led to string theory and a whole bunch of other things where people are trying to explain differences of experiences. And so I would say that in the same vein, there's remarkable universality in observing the golden rule, something outside of ourselves. This is something that Sandra Darling put together. It's 37 different references of the golden rule throughout literature and tradition, all faith traditions, Native American tradition, and I'll just read a couple of these. One should treat all beings as himself would be treated. Janus Sutakura, something circa 5th century BC. Hurt not others in ways that you hurt yourself would find hurtful, circa 500 BC, right? If your neighbor's jackal escapes into your garden, you should return the animal to its owner. And it is how you would want your neighbor to treat you. African bush proverb, right? I mean, I think that almost everybody can get to something outside of themselves. Unless, of course, you go to any of our elite institutions. Lewis takes that the next step, and that was his own conversion experience, which was to believe in the centrality of Christ. And so I'm going to now click through a couple of things in Mere Christianity, which of course is his great treatise and apologist work. If, on the other hand, you want to do something rather shabby, the life force, being only a blind force with no morals and no mind, will never interfere with you like that troublesome God we learned about when we were children. The life force is sort of a tame God. You can switch it on when you want, but it will not bother you. All the thrills of religion and none of the cost. Is the life force the greatest achievement of wishful thinking the world has yet seen? Then he has this long, I'll spare you the whole paragraph, although it's really good. He describes sort of, this is a segue into good and evil, right? He describes the battle as sort of a civil war, a rebellion, that we are living in part of the universe occupied by the rebel. That's how he describes us. So we are connected to this figure that is beyond the life force, and we're in the midst of a rebellion. And then this perhaps is the best known quote from Lewis on Christ. I am trying here to prevent anyone saying the really foolish thing that people often say about him. I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. This is the one thing we must not say. A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things that Jesus would not be a great moral teacher. He would be either a lunatic on a level with the man who says he's a poached egg, or else he'd be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. but let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to. And so, that Chesterton called Christ, of course, the hinge with which history spun around. But there is no escaping the fact that when you read Lewis, you have to focus on the fact that he truly believes in Christ as the central figure and the pivot of which we're moving around. And that's something he shares with Dietrich Bonhoeffer and all sorts of great folks. Okay, so now I'm really progressing. We will go to evil. And I think evil, it's so interesting because most people don't like to talk about evil. I don't like to talk about evil. It's kind of hard to imagine that it's something that exists. People have a fairly easy time believing in good and a really hard time believing in evil. I think Lewis and really Tolkien, right? The most dominant image of evil is the ring, right? The power of the ring and how it influences people. If you want to really get into the nuance and the effect of evil, reading Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit is just incredible. And so Lewis, of course, also does a super nice job playing with evil and the various dimensions of it. And he, so clear the slide. Going to talk about a few of the ways he represents evil in his books. First, in the upper corner, those are the children. That's the lamppost. They've just arrived in Narnia. And, the great thing there, of course, is Edmund. Everybody here knows what Edmund was tempted by. Turkish delight, and which he could never get enough of, right? It could never satisfy him. And he would have eaten it. I know the book, I don't have to read the quotation. He could have eaten it until he died. I mean, is there a better description of addiction? And that was twisting something that was good. That's another element of evil. It takes something that is good and twists it. And so that's the tricky thing with it. You can say, well, I think this is something that we really should think about. And then it gets twisted. And so you see that so beautifully with the children. Dropping down, that's Jadis, brought from the underworld. She becomes the White Witch ultimately in Narnia. And Uncle Andrew, who is seduced by evil just because it's so overwhelmed by her beauty. So it's kind of the weakness being seduced by something external that is evil. And Uncle Andrew actually, at the end, becomes a reasonably good guy, or at least benign, probably not good. And then the lower is Puzzle, the donkey, and Shift. And Shift is using people's belief systems and their desire for Aslan. Of course, he twists it and makes the donkey into a fake Aslan and confuses everybody. And the thing that one of the many things I love about Lewis is he's not binary. Here's one of the most interesting things. At the end of this book, the last battle, the new Narnia is created, right? And so here's the fun thing about Lewis. In Mere Christianity, he refers to Plato's cave. And in Plato's cave, you have the shadows. And if you just live in the cave, you would think the shadows are the reality, right? Because you don't know any different. And then you go outside of the cave and believe that, oh, wow, this is the real world. I was living in a cave and just seeing shadows. So, the biography of Lewis in the movie, right, with Anthony Hopkins, Shadowlands, it actually has it exactly opposite. I mean, that's not the way he's using shadows. It's the reality is the real Narnia. We are living in the shadows. We are seeing glimpses and images and all this stuff. So at the end of that story, the Narnians get into the real Narnia. They leave the cave, and he's twisted. Shift doesn't get in, but Puzzle does. And the Talamarine, one of the warriors against the Narnians, who was essentially, worshiping the wrong guy, Tash, over here, the false god, the evil entity, the demon, he does get into Narnia. I think one of the strongest theological statement that Lewis makes is that the Calamarine gets into Narnia. And it's this beautiful statement that when you were worshiping the thing that you thought was Tash, but you were worshiping good, you were really worshiping me. And there were Narnians who didn't get into Narnia, right? So it's looking at the soul. And then of course, this is another powerful one. So this is Diggory. The most autobiographical statement about Lewis is the relationship between Diggory and his mother, who's dying from cancer. And because Lewis's mother own died, right? If you want to get a glimpse of real Lewis in his deepest parts, it is the relationship between Diggory and his mother. And he is tempted to take the apple to go back and help his mother live. And he doesn't do it. Evil was tempting him for something really, really good to save his mother. And then, of course, Aslan makes her well, because he can take a seed, which becomes a tree, which is made into a wardrobe, and so it goes, right? But it's the subtlety of evil. It's the minor twist. And Lewis has this great quotation in, and of course, the screw tape letters, which I'll talk about in a second. It's the subtlety of evil, right? He goes, why use murder when cards would do? Right? That is a great Lewis quotation, which is the point of evil is to separate you from good, to separate you from God. And just to show you that I can jump around, which I know you were doubting, that is best described in, of course, The Great Divorce. This is about the bus that goes up into heaven with people that are sort of in between. And Lewis describes hell, which is where evil wants to take you, as separation and isolation. And what happens in The Great Divorce is that people have to let go of the thing that's holding them back. They have to relinquish it. And in many cases, it is pride, it's affection for your child, it's the inability to accept that someone else got into heaven, that you can't imagine how that guy got into heaven, and
I didn't understand that.
I tell you, isn't that Providence? And the only person that progresses, so George MacDonald is his guide through this. The only person that progresses in is someone that had a little lizard on his back, and the lizard on his back was lust, and it kept talking to him, and it was this dwarf. And then finally, the angel that confronted him said, let me tear it off, but you have to allow me to do it. It's this battle and this battle. And then he tears it off, throws it to the ground, and the lizard becomes a gorgeous stallion that takes him further up and further in. So when you're looking on the concepts of evil, the themes of twisting, the notion that it desires to separate, that all it really needs to do is separate you out. And so you have in here, and now I'm looking at the time, I'm not going to go through all these. They're really good. And I commend you to the book. The screw tape letters. You have the way the devil's screw tape is working to essentially do those things: twist, separate, divide, and the counsel on how the man, the patient, needs to turn away from that. And so it's just such an incredible treatment of the topic with its nuance. He also does a beautiful job of this in his nonfiction. I'll read one quick, okay? and only because it's so appropriate to all of us. The long, dull, monotonous years of middle age, prosperity or middle age adversity are excellent campaigning weather. Wow. So the last body of thought is the four loves. And again, kind of tying back to the march of Lewis through his observations. One of the gifts of Lewis is he gives us constructs. So what's actionable? How can we use this in a way that helps us in our daily lives? So clearing the slide, the four loves, starting down here with a group of people. Storge, which is affection, just happens. You're affectionate towards your dog. If you're exposed to something, you grow kind of fond of it, and that happens amongst friends and associates. Filio, brotherly love or friendship love. Sorry, I didn't do a good job of getting all different combinations of people, so I take nothing to that. And that is, I think Lewis was best known for introducing this type of love, because most people would think of eros, which we all know about, agape, maybe affection, but friendship as a type of love isn't really appreciated in our culture. And Lewis did such a marvelous job with that in his stories. And of course, that was his own experience with the inkling sitting around a crackling fire and talking all this stuff. Romantic love, eros, and then of course, agape, godly love. So I make a couple observations about Lewis's conception of love. The first is that loves are neither good nor bad. The love is neutral, right? A lot of what you see in the Great Divorce is a storge, affection towards the child, that becomes the dominant thing, which then becomes a demon. So the loves, and he says, keep in mind, this is the end of World War II. He says there was filio amongst members of the SS. That you can have deep attachment and not be doing good. The loves themselves are indifferent. The loves themselves can become false gods and can lead you in separation. And the main thing that you need to do is mediate these loves through agape love. And so that they're not distinct things. The relationship that you have in eros, storge, or filio comes through agape love. And he does this great quotation vis-a-vis Constantine, who in the Confessions had deeply loved a friend. The friend had passed, which was filio, and he drew the conclusion that just shows you that you shouldn't love deeply, and that you should only connect to God. And Lewis said, I disagree. Take some gumption to disagree with Constantine, or not Constantine. Who am I thinking? Augustine. Or no, who wrote the Confessions? Augustine. Yeah, okay. I get. Anyway, where I was somewhere around 322 BC or AD. But he said no. The conclusion is that you can only love deeply by mediating it through agape, or it's precisely it. You're going to hedge and not fully commit, or you're going to commit so fully that it becomes a false god. And that is such an incredible insight. And so that, and what he does so beautifully is that he describes essentially how that part of it, in Mere Christianity, he talks about the nature of God, which is God in front of you, pulling, longing, Christ beside you, walking with you, and the Holy Spirit within you. And it's this relational nature of all of these loves working together that ties it together with the longing, with the loves. And I found this to be a fabulous framework that Lewis has left us with. And so with that, I will stop. I'm saving you about half of my Post-it notes. but hopefully that is just an encouragement for you to pick up Lewis on your own and return to Narnia as I have recently done. So with that, I think just a few minutes of questions and then on to the 11 o'clock. Any comments, questions? I have all my mini numbers here. Okay, Carrie, thank you.
I'll throw one out here. Staying with the love, there's a quote from Jesus that she followed him after weaker now. It's always been a puzzling comment. Love your neighbor is so important. So is there any perspective on that?
I think the question, I think it's in, was it Matthew, where the person wants to follow Jesus, but he has great wealth. And he says, well, if you want to follow me, you got to leave all this stuff and follow me. And the man left because he was wealthy.
It's not just the wealth, it's the family, your wife, the relationship.
I think
It's not in that story.
and somewhere else. What I take from Lewis, and I take his notion of Aslan and his notion of God as one of abundance. And that in all of his stories, even though you are making choices that seem counter to your interest, Diggory bringing the apple back to save his mother, even though it seems pretty darn clear that that's to your advantage and maybe for a good reason, that when you're not operating within the relationship with God, you're not making the right choice. And when you do make that choice, even when it doesn't necessarily end well, right? The last battle, I describe it like a Bruce Willis film, except the good guys only start winning in the last 5 minutes, right? It's just everything goes bad for the entire book. And then at the end, there's remarkable abundance. And so I think it's about trust, and it's ultimately about abundance. And the thing that I've mentioned this before that I love about Lewis is he's not declarative. Simple books are good, bad, winners, losers. And Lewis covers the continuum because all of us live in a continuum. And so that's even though it's not apparent, we're in the cave. The reality is abundant. Yeah.
Where would you suggest starting with George MacDonald?
Fantasies. Yeah, the book that Lilith, MacDonald did a lot of fabulous stuff, but I would start there. And that's where Lewis starts. Lewis wrote the foreword to Anthology. And he recommends that as well. Yeah.
Say this, but I did not understand the book. My vocabulary did not include agape for love, agape for word. I got a little lost.
So agape is, I don't know what the direct translation of Greek is, but Lewis is referring to that as godly love. And so, and the thing that tying that back to longing, that's when I'm looking at Mount Rainier, that longing is attracting me to an energy source, which is agape love. That's how I have interpreted it. Other thoughts or questions on Lewis? Yeah.
I think everything is God. God is love, and he expresses everything. And I think this author did a great job of explaining in human terms how we can understand that. Do you think this is true?
Yeah, I think that the interesting thing about Lewis, so the question is, God is love, and how, my feeling of Lewis's interpretation of that. I think the thing that is so helpful with Lewis and what makes him so approachable is that, and Barfield said that, he never overcomplicates things, nor does he oversimplify things, right? And many times you read theologians and it's like, could you just have said it a little simpler? Or, maybe I'll throw this to a televangelist who I don't particularly appreciate. There's more to it than that, right? You know, they're not sophisticated enough in their thinking. Lewis finds the balance between those things, you know, and it's that great saying, you know, if I only had some more time, I'd write something shorter, right? Because he gets to the synthesis of it, and he looked at the issue so many different areas. You know, I think in part it was a huge blessing that he went through that long point in time of being an atheist, because he's poked at everything. He's looked at it 100 different ways. He's questioned it. And so that means if someone's super convinced and strong in their point of view, they can take folks questioning it and challenging it, right? If you disagree with them, they don't need to cancel you. He could sit with you because they understand their point of view, they're comfortable in it, and they're willing to let you have your point of view. And through that process, it was a great sifting that got down to these essential ideas, some of which we've talked about today. And then I will conclude, because I think I'm supposed to. When I went in this, you could give a whole, and I think super interesting talk on transformation. You could give talks on mentorship. I mean, you could go through Lewis's work and pull out another half dozen themes that could be worked and shown throughout their literature. So, you know, when I started off thinking, okay, I'm just going to do the greatest hits, and then I, you know, spent all the time, and I'm like, well, who am I kidding? There is so much more here. So I'll conclude with a thought and then a quick prayer. The thought is, I do hope to continue the Minion. Well, Elizabeth and I got to figure out travel and a few things like that, and what Omicron is doing to us and all those kind of things. But in mid to late January, and what I want to do is start with Mere Christianity. I think we should kind of go back to the basics and then start build from there. And so, and then return to Narnia and start at the beginning. So with that, I'll end in prayer. Dear Lord, thank you for C.S. Lewis, and thank you for his ability to show us a little bit more of Aslan and deepen our own understanding and faith. In Jesus' name we pray, amen. Thank you very much. And thank you.
Father Brown's